I've spent most of my life deep in the wilderness, working as a native forest ranger. My job took me through countless national parks and remote areas, always immersed in the vast, untamed beauty of nature. Along with that role came a certain understanding, a respect for the power and unpredictability of the wild. I was used to the way the forest felt, the way it seemed to have a pulse of its own, but there was never anything that truly frightened me. Not until I went to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park with my close friend, Mark. I had always heard the stories, the legends that haunted the edges of the Smokies. Whispers of strange lights in the sky, eerie figures lurking in the mist, and inexplicable events that seemed to warp reality. Growing up, I thought of them as just tales spun by locals to spice up the otherwise quiet lives they led in this ancient land. But as we ventured deeper into the park, I came to realize that some stories aren't as easily dismissed. Some things aren't just tales. The decision to go to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park had been an impulsive one. Mark and I were both passionate about hiking and exploring the untouched corners of America's wilderness. While most tourists flocked to the popular areas, we preferred to get lost in the wilderness, away from the crowded trails. This particular trip was meant to be another adventure, a test of our endurance and curiosity. We had no idea how much it would push us to our limits, how much it would change our lives. The Smoky Mountains were a natural wonder, a range of peaks that stretched across the border of North Carolina and Tennessee. Known for their thick, mist-laden forests and diverse ecosystems, they draw thousands of visitors each year. But behind the beauty, the mountains held something far older. An ancient presence, a history that stretched back before the establishment of the park, and far before settlers arrived. We arrived at the park on a crisp autumn morning. The mountains were alive with color, the trees flaunting their shades of amber and gold. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and I felt that familiar rush of excitement. There was something timeless about the Smokies, the way the mist hung low over the hills and valleys, cloaking the world in a layer of mystery. It was perfect for exploring, a place where the past and present seemed to blend together in a seamless tapestry. We decided to head for one of the more remote trails, an old path that wound its way deep into the heart of the park. It wasn't a popular route, and that was exactly what we wanted. As we set up camp near the trailhead, I couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The trees felt thicker here, the silence deeper. The sounds of the forest, birds, rustling leaves, the occasional animal call, seemed muffled, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I brushed it off as my imagination, but Mark, always the skeptic, seemed uneasy too. That night, as we sat around the campfire, I noticed how quickly the darkness enveloped the woods. The trees seemed to stretch up higher than I'd ever remembered, and the air turned heavy, thick with moisture. The mist rolled in, as it always did, but it was denser, more oppressive than I had ever seen it. It made everything feel unreal, as though we were no longer in the present but in a place stuck between time itself. Mark was the first to break the silence. He mentioned how the park had a reputation for strange occurrences, but I wasn't concerned. I dismissed it as nothing more than local folklore. We were far from the beaten path, and I was sure that the only thing we'd encounter would be the usual wildlife. But as the firelight flickered and shadows danced in the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It wasn't the usual sounds of the forest that had always been comforting to me. This was different. The air felt thick with something else, something ancient. The next morning, as we set off to explore the deeper parts of the park, things started to feel stranger. The trail we were on seemed to stretch on longer than I had expected. The trees were massive, their trunks so thick they could have been hundreds of years old. Mark was still talking about the eerie stories, but his voice had lost its usual bravado. He, too, had started to notice the strange atmosphere in the woods. The air felt heavier, as though it was thick with something that didn't belong. Around midday, we encountered a section of the trail that was overgrown and barely passable. The path seemed to fade into the forest itself, as if the mountains were trying to reclaim it. We pushed through, trying to make our way forward, but the sense of being watched grew with every step. The trees, the rocks, even the ground beneath us felt different, alive, almost. It was as though the very earth we were walking on had a heartbeat of its own. We pressed on, determined to reach a clearing I'd read about in my ranger's notes. A hidden spot that supposedly offered breathtaking views of the park. But as we got closer, the weather started to change. A sudden chill swept over the land, and the mist, which had been hovering in the distance, began to close in on us. Mark looked around nervously, but I still chalked it up to a sudden weather change, a common occurrence in the mountains. The clearing never came. The trees grew denser, the mist thicker, and we seemed to be walking in circles. It felt as though we were being drawn deeper into the forest, as if the mountains themselves were guiding our every step. But with every passing hour, that sense of unease only grew stronger. The forest was alive in ways I couldn't comprehend, and I began to wonder whether there was something more to the legends of this place. That night, as we set up camp in a small clearing, we noticed the first strange sound, a faint whisper on the wind, just out of earshot. At first, I dismissed it as the usual sounds of nature, but the more we listened, the more we realized that it wasn't a natural sound at all. It was words, low and guttural, like voices lost to time, carried on the wind. Mark froze. He looked at me wide-eyed, and for the first time on the trip, I saw fear in his eyes. The whispers continued, growing louder, as though they were drawing closer. The air around us seemed to grow colder, and the night, which should have been peaceful, became suffocating. The trees swayed despite the lack of wind, and the sky above us seemed to darken unnaturally. We were no longer alone, and then the first shadow appeared. This would only be the beginning. From that moment on, the park would never be the same for us. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park was hiding more than just beauty and mystery. It was hiding something far older, far darker, and we had unwittingly walked straight into its embrace. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park is vast, over 500,000 acres of protected land straddling the borders of Tennessee and North Carolina. Its beauty is unparalleled, a sanctuary of ancient trees, mist-clad valleys, and hidden waterfalls. To most visitors, it's a place to escape from the chaos of modern life and immerse themselves in nature. But beneath its serene exterior lies something much older, something that has haunted the mountains long before humans first set foot in them as a native forest ranger. I had walked through many remote areas of the country, but the Smokies were different. There was a weight to the land here that I couldn't easily describe, a kind of energy that seemed to hum beneath the surface. Over the years, I had read about the park's history, how it had once been a land of mystery and superstition to the Native American tribes that inhabited the area. They called it Shakenage, meaning the place of the blue smoke, a reference to the mists that rose from the valleys and shrouded the mountains in an ethereal glow. Even then, they spoke of the land as if it had its own will, a force that couldn't be easily tamed. Mark, my companion on this ill-fated trip, was more of a skeptic. A geologist by trade, he had always viewed nature through a scientific lens. Rocks, minerals, and the geology of the land were his realm. Where I saw mystery, he saw natural phenomena, and where I believed in the supernatural, he relied on logic and reason. We had known each other since college, and while our paths diverged in terms of our careers, our shared love for adventure kept us close. But I had always felt that there was something about the forest that Mark couldn't quite grasp. The land spoke to me in ways that he couldn't understand, and it had always been a point of quiet contention between us. We arrived in the Smokies after a long drive from the outskirts of Knoxville. The journey itself had been uneventful, just a steady drive through the winding roads that cut through the foothills of the mountains. But when we reached the park's entrance, everything seemed to change. The mist that blanketed the mountains in the distance had begun to roll down into the valleys. There was a heaviness to the air, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. The trees, tall and ancient, seemed to loom over us, their gnarled branches twisting toward the sky. It felt as though we were entering a place out of time, a land where the usual rules didn't apply. Mark was excited. He had heard stories from locals about the legends of the park, tales of ghostly apparitions, strange lights in the sky, and mysterious disappearances, but he dismissed them as myths. He loved the idea of exploring the park, of charting the geological formations that dotted its vast expanse. I, on the other hand, had my reservations. I had heard my fair share of stories, too, And while I was trained to be pragmatic and level-headed in my work, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease about this place. There was something ancient in the air here, a presence that lingered just beneath the surface, something waiting. But I kept my thoughts to myself. I didn't want to scare Mark off or make him doubt our plans. I was here to explore, to study, and to prove that these superstitions were nothing more than folklore. The first night we camped in the park was uneventful, but there was an undercurrent of strangeness that I couldn't shake. We set up our tents near a stream, the water trickling softly through the forest. The mist had settled heavily around us, creating a hazy shroud that blurred the outlines of the trees. The temperature dropped quickly, and the air turned damp and cold. But the silence of the forest was the most striking thing. There was no rustling of animals, no chirping of insects, nothing. Just a stillness that seemed unnatural for a place so full of life. Mark had tried to keep the mood light, making jokes about the old folktales and teasing me about my overactive imagination. I couldn't argue with him, he was right, of course. It was probably just the stillness of the night playing tricks on me. Still, I found it hard to shake the feeling that we weren't alone. There was a heaviness in the air, a palpable sense of being watched as the night wore on. The fog grew thicker, wrapping itself around our camp like a living thing. The trees seemed to draw closer, their twisted branches almost appearing to reach out toward us. I started to hear soft sounds, distant whispers that seemed to echo on the wind. I tried to brush them off as the wind through the trees or the sound of animals moving through the forest. But Mark had stopped talking. He was staring into the mist, his eyes wide, his expression one of unease. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice low that I frowned, unsure of what he was talking about. I'd heard the whispers too, but I hadn't wanted to acknowledge them. "It's just the wind," I said, trying to sound confident. But Mark shook his head. "No, it's not. It's like someone's talking, very softly." I looked around, my heart beginning to race. The forest was too quiet. Even the stream seemed to have muted its sound, as if the world was holding its breath. "Maybe we should head back," Mark suggested, standing up and grabbing his backpack. "This place doesn't feel right." But before I could answer, I heard it, faint but unmistakable. A low, guttural voice, calling out from somewhere deep within the mist. The words were too distorted to understand, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a voice that didn't belong, one that seemed to rise from the earth itself. That I froze. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't just the mist. Something was in the forest with us, that we weren't alone. And then, the whispering grew louder. It was no longer just a distant murmur. It was as though the forest itself was alive, breathing, calling to us. Something ancient, something primal was stirring in the shadows. The park wasn't just a collection of trees and rocks. It was a living, breathing entity, and it had been waiting for us. Waiting for me, waiting for Mark. The tension in the air grew thicker with every passing minute. The fog had enveloped our camp entirely now, and the once familiar trees around us were nothing more than shadows and silhouettes. The whispers had escalated, their guttural tone now unmistakable. I had been a forest ranger for years, and I'd heard plenty of strange things in the woods, but nothing had ever felt like this before. This wasn't just nature playing tricks. This was something else entirely, something malevolent, and it was closing in on us. Mark, normally the more rational one, was visibly shaken. He had grabbed his flashlight and was scanning the edges of the camp, his eyes darting between the dark shapes of the trees, as though waiting for something to emerge. "Did you hear that?" he asked again, his voice trembling. It's not the wind. This is something else." I didn't answer, couldn't. I was too busy listening, trying to make sense of the haunting sound that seemed to be growing in intensity. It was a voice, low and drawn out, calling our names in the dead of night. But it wasn't a human voice. It had a strange cadence, a rhythm that felt unnatural, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the earth itself, not from a person. The whispers seemed to shift in and out of languages I couldn't understand, like some forgotten dialect mixed with guttural growls. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone in the forest anymore. We had crossed some line, stepped beyond the threshold of the known world into something darker, something that had lived in the Smokies for centuries. The weight of the place, the presence that I had felt ever since we arrived, had been building to this moment, and now it was upon us. Whatever had been watching us from the shadows was ready to make itself known. "We need to get out of here," Mark insisted, his voice tight with panic. He was already backing away from the campfire, the beam of his flashlight jerking around nervously. I could see his breath coming in short, quick bursts, his anxiety taking over. But something in me resisted. I had spent years as a ranger, studying the land, its rhythms, its pulse. I knew the Smokies better than most, and yet, this felt different. It wasn't just the eerie atmosphere. It wasn't just the fog, the strange whispers, or the overwhelming feeling that the forest was alive. It was something deeper, an instinct, a gut feeling that I couldn't ignore. We were in danger, yes, but not in the way we thought. The forest wasn't trying to drive us away, it was trying to make us see. "I don't think we should leave," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark stopped in his tracks, his flashlight flicking to me, eyes wide with disbelief. "What?" he breathed. "Are you crazy? This is exactly why we need to leave. Something's wrong. I can feel it." But I didn't care. I didn't know why, but I felt compelled to stay. Maybe it was the ranger in me, the part of me that had seen so much of the wilderness and understood it, or maybe it was the part of me that had known all along that this was coming. I had felt it when we first arrived, when the mist rolled in and the air seemed to thicken around us, as if we were being watched by 1,000 unseen eyes. "I can't explain it, Mark," I said, my voice steady. "But I think we need to stay and see what this is. I don't think this is something we can run from." Mark's face twisted in disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me. You want us to stay here and what? Play along with whatever this is?" I shook my head. "No.
I am not playing along."
But this isn't just about us anymore. It's about understanding what's happening here. The tension in the air grew unbearable. The whispers were now rising to a crescendo, the voices so distorted that they no longer resembled any language. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Something had begun to shift in the forest around us. It was subtle at first, but then it became undeniable. The ground beneath our feet began to vibrate, not in a seismic way, but in a deep, resonating hum, as though the earth itself were alive, stretching, shifting, breathing. I looked at Mark. His eyes were wide with fear, his body frozen. He wasn't a believer in the supernatural, but the experience was too much for him to deny now. Mark started, but his voice cut off suddenly. His gaze shifted, and I followed it, turning to see what had caught his attention. There, in the fog, a figure appeared. At first, it was just a silhouette, tall, impossibly tall, standing motionless in the distance. But as I squinted into the fog, I could see the faint outline of its form. It was human, or at least seemed to be, but something about it was wrong. The figure's proportions were elongated, its limbs stretching in unnatural ways, and its face, if it even had one, was obscured by the mist, a shadow that seemed to warp and flicker in the strange light. "Do you see that?" Mark breathed, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I had seen things in the woods, but nothing like this. The figure stood still, watching us, its presence suffocating. It felt like the very air had turned to stone, frozen in time, holding its breath, waiting for something. Then, the whispering came again, louder this time, almost as if the figure was speaking directly to us. It wasn't words that I could understand, but there was a tone to it, an emotion, a deep, ancient sorrow that reverberated through my chest. The vibration in the earth intensified. The very ground seemed to tremble beneath us, as though something was stirring beneath the surface, awakening from a long slumber. And then, the figure moved. It wasn't a step, more like a slow, deliberate glide, as though it was floating across the ground, drawing closer to us. The mist parted in its wake, revealing more of its distorted form. Its arms reached out, long, unnaturally long, stretching toward us, as if to grasp us. In that moment, every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to flee, to escape the terror that was unfolding before us. But something held me there, rooted to the ground. We had come here to explore the Smokies, but now we were participants in something far bigger than ourselves. We weren't just visitors. We had crossed into a place where the past and present collided, a realm where the earth itself carried the weight of centuries, where the old gods and spirits of the mountains still lingered, waiting. And now, it seemed, they had noticed us. This was no longer a simple journey into the wilderness. It was a reckoning as Mark and I stood frozen, witnessing the figure slowly glide toward us through the fog. A series of thoughts and realizations began to unfold in my mind, adding layers of complexity to our dire situation. What we were facing wasn't merely a terrifying apparition or a supernatural encounter. It was a puzzle of a much greater magnitude, one that intertwined with the very fabric of the Smoky Mountains themselves. The past of the Smoky Mountains. One aspect of the park that had always fascinated me, even before I became a ranger, was the ancient history of the Smoky Mountains. It wasn't just the trees or the wildlife that spoke of age, but the land itself, its scars, its ruins, and its secrets buried deep beneath the surface. As a native, I had grown up hearing stories from my elders about the spirits of the mountains, the beings who had lived there long before settlers arrived, and the mysterious forces that govern the land. The elders spoke of the guardians, spirits that protected the mountains from outsiders who sought to exploit its beauty and resources. But what if these spirits were more than mere folklore? What if they had been patiently watching over the land all along, waiting for someone to disturb the delicate balance? We had done just that by venturing into this sacred space. My mind was racing, piecing together the fragments of stories and legends I had heard over the years. The forest, it seemed, was not simply a collection of trees and wildlife. It was a living, breathing entity that interacted with those who dared to uncover its mysteries. The figure we were seeing now, the one gliding toward us with its elongated limbs, wasn't just a product of our fear. It was a manifestation of the guardians, perhaps a physical form that represented the ancient presence we had unknowingly disturbed. But why now? Why had this presence waited until we were deep within the heart of the Smokies to reveal itself? Mark's fear and growing doubts. Throughout this ordeal, Mark had been the practical one, the voice of reason. His rational mind was an anchor, keeping us grounded in the face of the supernatural. But even he could not deny the strange occurrences that were escalating around us. As he looked at the figure, his fear was palpable, and I could see the skepticism that had once defined him cracking. He had never believed in ghosts, spirits, or anything that couldn't be scientifically explained. But this was different. Do you think it's real?" he whispered, his voice trembling. His question hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. I didn't answer immediately. How could I? We had both seen things in these woods that defied explanation. Things that could not be simply written off as coincidence or our overactive imaginations. What had started as a simple research trip to catalog plant species and document the biodiversity of the park had turned into an encounter with something far more primal, far more ancient. I could tell Mark was struggling to reconcile the world he had known with the terrifying reality unfolding before us. Yet, despite the fear, there was something in Mark's eyes that shifted. He wasn't just scared. He was questioning everything. The scientific knowledge he held dear was no longer enough to explain what was happening. His mind was beginning to unravel in real time, and I wondered how he would process all of this once we made it out. If we made it out. The connection to my past. As the figure moved closer, I felt a strange connection to it. An unsettling recognition, like I had seen this entity before, perhaps in a dream, perhaps in an old legend told to me as a child. This wasn't the first time I had encountered something strange in the woods. In fact, I had experienced a similar incident years earlier when I was still a young ranger, though at the time I had dismissed it as a figment of my imagination. Now, I couldn't help but wonder if I had unknowingly crossed paths with something far older than I had ever anticipated. The first incident had been subtle, like a whisper in the woods, a feeling of being watched, but I had ignored it. I had chalked it up to fatigue or a trick of the mind. But now, in the presence of the figure before us, everything felt connected. The strange occurrences, the whispers in the fog, the deep vibration in the ground, the inexplicable pull to stay. Everything pointed back to something much bigger than the Smoky Mountains themselves. It was as if the land was testing me, testing us, to see if we were worthy of knowing its deepest secrets. The fear of the unknown. One of the most complicated aspects of this experience was the fear of the unknown. I had always prided myself on being a rational thinker, someone who could understand the mechanics of the world around me. But this was beyond anything I had ever encountered. I didn't know if it was an ancient spirit, a creature from the depths of the earth, or something else entirely. And that uncertainty made everything worse. The ambiguity of the situation left me feeling helpless. Mark's growing panic mirrored my own. We had no clear plan, no idea of how to escape or even if we should. We were trapped in a liminal space between the known and the unknown, unable to escape the pull of the figure that was inching closer. I kept telling myself that we needed to remain calm, that we had to approach this with the same logical mindset I had used for years in the field. But the longer we stood there, the more I realized that logic had no place here. The Smokies were playing by their own rules, and we were just players in their game. The whispering voices. As the figure continued its slow approach, the whispers became more insistent. The voices were no longer just background noise. They had become a chorus, a cacophony of sounds that filled the air around us. They weren't in any language I recognized, but they carried a sense of urgency, as if they were trying to communicate something important. The most unsettling part of the whispers was the way they seemed to speak directly to us, even when we weren't moving or speaking aloud. It was as though the forest itself had a mind, a consciousness, and it was now trying to reach us. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel the emotion behind them: rage, sorrow, and a deep, unyielding sense of warning. The voices weren't just in the air, they were in our minds, too. I could sense Mark's thoughts turning chaotic, his mind battling to make sense of the impossible. The deeper the whispers went, the harder it became to distinguish reality from illusion. Were we hearing this because the forest wanted us to, or was it simply our minds fracturing under the pressure of the unknown? The complexity of this moment, of the creature before us, the forest around us, the emotions swirling inside of us, was overwhelming. What we had stumbled upon was something far more intricate and ancient than either of us could have ever imagined. And the whispers, the figure, and the shifting ground were only the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead, understanding the true nature of the Smoky Mountains and what would happen to us if we failed to uncover its deepest secrets. The moment the figure drew nearer, my pulse quickened, and I could feel my throat tighten. The air felt colder, heavier, and every instinct in my body screamed for us to flee. Yet, as the mist thickened and the figure seemed to emerge from the very fog itself, something within me held me in place. It wasn't just fear, it was something else, something far more primal. I had been a ranger in these mountains long enough to know when something was wrong, but this felt different. This felt ancient. I could sense Mark's breath on the back of my neck, his presence shifting from the usual quiet strength to one of palpable dread. He was no longer standing beside me as my friend, my colleague in this wild and uncharted terrain. He had become someone else, someone consumed by the realization that we were no longer in control of our fate. His eyes darted from me to the figure, then back again, his thoughts running faster than his ability to voice them. Is this real? Mark's voice was barely a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might shatter whatever tenuous grip we had on reality. I don't know, I replied, my own voice thin, strained. But we're about to find out. The fog swirled around us like a living thing, pushing us forward, wrapping us in its embrace, making it difficult to breathe, to think. The figure, now closer than ever, was no longer an indistinct shape. It had a form, tall, angular, almost human, but there was nothing human about it. Its limbs were elongated, impossibly thin, and the way it moved wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. It seemed to glide, its movements smooth and fluid, like it was part of the mist itself. A voice, not unlike the whispering we had heard before, echoed through the fog. This time, however, it wasn't a distant murmur. It was right here. It spoke in a language that sent chills racing down my spine, a guttural and ancient tongue that carried an eerie, hypnotic quality. It was as if the very words were imprinted on our souls, seeping deep into our consciousness, stripping away every layer of doubt. That I turned to Mark, but he was frozen, his eyes wide with terror. I knew he was hearing it too, that same sense of dread coursing through his veins, tightening his chest. We had come here for research to understand the land, the park, the flora and fauna. We had no way of knowing that the very thing we sought to understand was about to make itself known. That I took a step forward, unable to help myself. There was a pull, a magnetic force that seemed to draw me closer to the figure. It was not just curiosity. It was something deeper, something rooted in the very bones of the mountains themselves. I had felt it before, during my time as a ranger, those fleeting moments when the forest seemed alive, when it spoke to you in ways you couldn't explain. But this was different. It wasn't just the forest that was alive. It was the very land itself. And whatever was before us was a part of that living entity. "Do you hear it?" Mark finally managed to choke out. His voice was shaking, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. Rationally, he was trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was no way to explain it. There was no scientific theory that could account for what was unfolding before us. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if he could see me. The fog had grown thick, now almost solid, obscuring everything but the figure ahead. But I felt its presence, a weight that pressed down on us both. Asterisk, we shouldn't be here. Asterisk, Mark whispered again, his voice almost pleading. He grabbed my arm, his grip desperate, pulling me back. We need to leave. Now. The pull I felt toward the figure was growing stronger, and I shook my head, trying to pull away from Mark's hand. There was no way I could explain it, but I knew that something was about to happen, something that would change everything. It was then that I saw it. The figure reached out, its long fingers extending toward me, but they were not human fingers. They were thin and covered in a dark, mottled substance, like tree bark, or maybe something older. Something that didn't belong to this world. In that instant, a flood of memories came rushing back to me. Not memories of my childhood or even my time as a ranger, but something older, deeper, from beyond my own understanding. I remembered stories, fragments of tales told to me by elders in my tribe, stories about beings that dwelled in the heart of the mountains. These weren't just tales, they were warnings about the guardians of the land, protectors of the mountains who could not be reasoned with. A voice inside my mind screamed at me to run, to get out before it was too late. But there was nowhere to run. The fog had closed in completely, and the world around us had become an abyss of shadows and mist. The figure stopped just short of touching me, its fingers hovering in the air. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it raised its head. I saw eyes, or what I assumed were eyes, glowing faintly in the mist, empty and infinite. The darkness in them was suffocating, and for a moment, I thought I could hear the very heartbeat of the mountains echoing in the space between us. Leave. The figure spoke, its voice no longer a whisper, but a deep, resonant command. The sound vibrated through my chest, shaking me to the core. I stumbled back, heart hammering, my breath caught in my throat. Mark's grip on my arm tightened, and I could see the terror in his eyes. His lips were trembling, but there was no question in his mind now. We had crossed a threshold we could never uncross. That I didn't know if the figure's words were meant to warn us or if they were a final decree. But in that moment, I understood something that I hadn't before. The Smoky Mountains were not just a national park. They were a realm unto themselves, a place where the rules of reality bent and shifted, where time and space had no meaning, and where the guardians of the land were the ultimate arbiters of who would stay and who would leave. I looked at Mark, who was now more terrified than I had ever seen him. He knew, too. He knew that we had just uncovered something so profound, so dangerous, that there was no turning back. Whatever the figure represented, whatever the Smoky Mountains were hiding, we had only just begun to understand the consequences of our trespass. With a deep breath, I nodded at Mark. We have to go. Now. And as we turned to flee, the figure's low, resonating voice followed us, its words echoing in the fog, a chilling reminder that some places were never meant to be understood. As Mark and I stumbled away from the figure, the fog around us seemed to thicken, almost as if it was pushing us forward, urging us to leave with an intensity that was both unnerving and terrifying. The cold seeped into my bones, and the eerie silence that followed the figure's departure was deafening. My mind raced, still struggling to process what had just happened, what we had seen, and what we had narrowly escaped. Every step felt heavier, more deliberate, as though the very land beneath our feet was trying to keep us from leaving. Mark was silent, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. He had always been the rational one, the one who believed in science and facts, but now, in the wake of what we had experienced, I could see the disbelief in his eyes. The mountain had a way of changing people, of forcing them to confront something beyond their understanding. And for the first time, I saw in Mark the raw terror of someone who had witnessed something they could not explain or deny. "Do you think we're safe?" Mark finally whispered, his voice low and shaky. I wanted to tell him that everything would be fine, that it was over and we could just get back to the car and leave. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The mountain had touched us, had shown us something that would haunt us forever, and no amount of distance would erase the feeling that something was watching us, following us. "I don't know," I muttered, my voice thick with uncertainty. "But I don't think we're out of danger yet." We pushed forward through the thickening fog, our steps quickening, our breath shallow. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure following us, its pale, glowing eyes locked onto us from within the fog. But there was nothing. The mist had closed in completely, and the world around us seemed to blur into a strange, otherworldly haze. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the land was alive, that something unseen was moving. Tracking us as we reached the edge of the forest, the trees began to thin, and I thought I could see the distant glow of the parking lot lights. We were close, but my heart dropped when I realized something that made my stomach churn. The world around us had shifted. The landscape, the trees, the way the ground beneath our feet felt. It was all wrong. We had passed through the same stretch of forest earlier, and it hadn't looked like this. The terrain was subtly different, as if we had crossed some invisible boundary into a different version of the mountain. A version that was foreign to us, unwelcoming and ancient. "Mark," I said, my voice a little more urgent now. "Something's not right. The forest, it's changed. This isn't where we were before." Mark's gaze flicked around, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. "No, this can't be happening," he muttered. "We were just there, right? The parking lot. It's supposed to be right there." We began to walk faster, but every step seemed to take us further into the unknown. The mist pressed in, and the familiar landmarks we had passed earlier now seemed distant, unreachable. The park, once a place of beauty and nature, now felt like a maze, a distorted reflection of reality. The more we moved, the more it felt like the mountain itself was playing with us, toying with our sense of time and place. That I glanced down at my watch. It was nearly 10 p.m., but as I looked around, I couldn't help but feel that something had changed. The moon had disappeared behind the clouds, and the air felt even colder than before, the wind carrying a strange, low hum that seemed to vibrate in my chest. It was as though the mountain itself was speaking to us, but in a language we couldn't understand. I stopped abruptly. Mark almost bumped into me, his face creased with confusion. "Wait," I said, my voice hoarse. "We've been walking in circles. We should have hit the parking lot by now. But instead, we're back at the same place." I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the surroundings, and that's when I saw it. The figure again, standing in the distance, barely visible through the fog. But this time it was different. The figure wasn't just a silhouette. It was closer, clearer. It was no longer just a strange, almost humanoid shape. Now I could see details. Its eyes glowed brighter, its fingers elongated further, and there was an unmistakable presence to it. A sense that it was no longer just watching us. It was waiting. A sickening feeling twisted in my gut, and I felt the weight of my own fear settle over me like a heavy blanket. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it watching, waiting for something. Something that we hadn't done yet. Something we were about to trigger. I had no idea what it wanted, but I knew it wouldn't stop until it got what it was waiting for. "Mark, we need to leave. Now." My voice was frantic, desperate. I grabbed his arm and started pulling him back, trying to move in the opposite direction. But Mark didn't respond. His face was blank, his eyes fixed on the figure. "Mark!" I shouted, shaking him, but there was no reaction. His pupils had dilated, his breath shallow and erratic. He wasn't in control anymore. It was like the mountain had taken him, like it had claimed him in some unfathomable way. And in that moment, I understood whatever this was, it wasn't just an entity. It was the mountain itself, the heart of it, the ancient force that protected this land from outsiders. And we had trespassed too far. I had to act, or I would lose Mark completely. I pulled him away, shaking him harder, hoping to break whatever trance he was under. The figure didn't follow us, but its presence was heavy, suffocating. Finally, Mark blinked, and the fog around us seemed to lift just a little. He looked at me, eyes wide with confusion. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, pulling him towards what I hoped was the way out. "But we're not alone here, and if we don't leave, we might never get out." As we continued through the fog, the weight of what we had just experienced settled heavily on me. We weren't just running from the figure, we were running from something older, something that didn't just live in the mountains. It was the mountain itself, and we had stirred something that should never have been awakened. And I knew, with a certainty I couldn't ignore, that we had just scratched the surface of something far darker and far more dangerous than we could have ever imagined. The next few hours felt like a blur, a sickening whirl of fog, fear, and confusion. Mark and I stumbled through the woods, trying to find some semblance of direction. The once familiar landscape had become alien, like a twisted reflection of itself. Every tree, every rock seemed to mock us, as if it were part of some cruel game the mountain had set in motion. We were lost. More than that, we were being hunted. I tried to focus on the one thing that seemed certain, the need to get out of this nightmare. But with each passing moment, I felt my resolve weakening. The longer we stayed on the mountain, the more I could feel its pull. It was like it had a grip on my very soul, bending my thoughts, distorting my sense of reality. Mark, too, seemed to be losing his grasp on himself. His eyes were vacant, his movements sluggish, as if the mountain had drained him of something vital. We were both caught in its web, and I feared that we might never escape. But amidst the growing despair, something inside me began to stir, a flicker of clarity, of strength. I remembered why I had become a forest ranger in the first place. It wasn't just to protect the land, it was to understand it, to connect with it in a way that most people never would. I had always believed that nature was alive, that it had its own rhythm, its own spirit. The problem was that I had underestimated how deeply the land could affect a person, how much power it could hold over those who were foolish enough to cross its boundaries. Now, I realized the mountain wasn't just a place of beauty and wilderness. It was something much more ancient, something older than any human could comprehend. The figure we had seen wasn't just a ghost or an illusion. It was a guardian, a sentinel, a manifestation of the mountain itself. And it was protecting something we had disturbed. We needed to understand that if we were to survive, we had to let go of our fear and confront what was happening, rather than running from it. For the first time since we had entered the mountain, I made a decision that would change everything. I would face whatever was out there. I would find a way to end this, to free us both from whatever curse had been unleashed. "Mark," I said, my voice steady despite the terror still clawing at my chest. "We need to stop running. We can't keep running forever. We need to understand this place." Mark didn't respond immediately. His face was pale, and his eyes still held that vacant, distant look, as if the mountain had claimed him in some intangible way. But I saw a flicker of recognition, a flash of the person I knew beneath the fear. "I'm not sure I can," he whispered, his voice breaking. "It feels like it's too much, like it's inside my head." I put a hand on his shoulder, a firm but gentle gesture. "I know it's hard, but we have to face this together. The only way out is through. We have to find the heart of the mountain and confront whatever is pulling us in." Mark nodded slowly, as if my words were finally reaching him. And for the first time in hours, I saw something other than fear in his eyes, resolve. We had a choice to make, and if we wanted to survive, we couldn't let the mountain break us. We began moving again, with purpose this time. It wasn't just about finding our way out anymore. It was about finding the truth. We needed to understand what had brought us here, what the mountain was protecting, and what it wanted from us. As we walked, I found myself thinking about the strange figure. It wasn't just a creature of the fog. It was something much deeper. The mountain had guardians, I now understood, but they weren't just there to keep intruders out. They were there to protect something ancient, something sacred, and we had unknowingly crossed a line. The figure, the mist, the disorienting changes in the landscape. They were all signs of a deeper power at work. I shared my thoughts with Mark as we moved forward, and he seemed to understand. His own fear began to shift, turning into a quiet determination. It wasn't just about escaping anymore, it was about making things right. If the mountain was truly alive, then we had to respect it, understand it. We couldn't fight it, but we could learn from it. Maybe, just maybe, we could make peace. As we neared the heart of the park, the fog started to lift, though the chill remained. The eerie silence was replaced by the soft sound of the wind in the trees. We were closer now, closer to something we both felt but couldn't yet explain. It was like the mountain itself was watching us, guiding us toward something we were meant to find. Finally, we came upon a clearing. In the center, there was an ancient stone structure, half covered in moss and vines. It looked like a relic from a time long forgotten, and it radiated a strange energy, one that felt both unsettling and calming. This was it, the heart of the mountain. That I stepped forward cautiously, Mark following closely behind. We had made it this far, and we were ready to face whatever awaited us. As I approached the stone structure, I could feel a vibration in the air, a hum that seemed to resonate deep within me. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling, a pulse that matched my own heartbeat. Then, the fog parted completely, and the figure appeared once again, this time standing before the structure. It didn't approach us, but it didn't need to. It was there, watching us, waiting. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. This time, I wasn't afraid. I knew what I had to do. I reached out toward the structure, my hand trembling as I touched the cold stone. In that moment, the fog began to lift completely, and the figure seemed to dissipate into the air, its presence fading like a distant memory. We had done it. We had faced the heart of the mountain, and we had come to understand it. The fear, the confusion, the terror, they all began to fade, replaced by a profound sense of peace. The mountain had tested us, but we had learned from it, and in doing so, we had found our way back to ourselves. Mark looked at me, his face no longer pale, his eyes clear. We had both grown from this experience. We had been through something unimaginable, but we had overcome it together. And as we turned to leave the clearing, I realized something that I would carry with me forever. True strength isn't just about surviving. It's about learning to listen to the land, to understand its rhythms, and to respect its power. The mountain had changed us, but it had also given us something priceless. The knowledge that we could face even the darkest places and come out stronger on the other side. Mark and I stood there in the clearing, our minds still reeling from the shocking revelations of the past few hours. A quiet tension hung in the air. The mountain had become something far greater than we could have ever anticipated. It was no longer just a place to observe nature, to conduct research, or even a backdrop for the stories that had been told about it. It had become a living, breathing entity, a vast, sentient force that had drawn us into its depths for a reason we were only beginning to understand. That we had reached the threshold, the heart of the mountain, where the answers waited. The stone structure in the clearing loomed before us like an ancient monument, its weathered surface reflecting the timeless nature of the park. This place was sacred, and whatever had been set into motion when we first ventured into these woods was now coming to a head. Every step we had taken up until now had brought us closer to this moment, the culmination of the strange events, the terrifying figures, and the overwhelming sense of dread that had consumed us. For a moment, it felt as if time itself had paused. The eerie silence was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves, the distant calls of unseen creatures, and the deep, throbbing hum that seemed to reverberate from within the stone structure. It was as if the very land was holding its breath, waiting for us to make our next move. We had come so far, but we knew that the true test was yet to come. What lay inside this mysterious place? What had the mountain been guarding, and how would it react to our intrusion? Mark and I exchanged a look, one that carried the weight of everything we had endured. The fear that had once paralyzed us had now transformed into something more resolute. We had no choice but to continue. Backtracking was no longer an option. The mountain wouldn't allow it, and neither would we. We were too far into this, too connected to the land now to simply turn around and walk away. We had to face whatever came next. "We need to be careful," I whispered to Mark, my voice barely carrying over the silence. "This place, it's not like anything we've encountered before. We've crossed a line, and now we need to honor it. We need to be patient and let the mountain show us what it wants." Mark nodded silently, but I could see the uncertainty still lingering in his eyes. It wasn't just the strange energy that hung in the air that unsettled him. It was the feeling that we were no longer in control. We had been the ones leading our expedition, determining the course of our journey. Now, the mountain seemed to have taken over, guiding us towards something we couldn't fully comprehend. I turned back to the stone structure. There was a calmness in its presence, but it was also an invitation, an unspoken command to step forward. Every instinct in me screamed to approach it with reverence, with an understanding that the mountain was ancient, far older than anything we could fathom. It had seen the rise and fall of civilizations, the quiet passage of centuries, and it had never once bent to the will of mankind. Now, for reasons we couldn't explain, it had chosen us to bear witness to its secrets. "Let's move," I said finally, my voice steady. "We're here. We need to understand what's going on." We approached the stone structure slowly, each step heavy with the weight of everything that had happened so far. It wasn't just the figure we had seen, the ghostly presence that had seemed to haunt us, or the strange fog that had disoriented us for hours. It was the deeper sense that the land itself was alive, aware of us in ways we couldn't even begin to grasp. The closer we got, the stronger the hum became. It felt almost like a pulse, a heartbeat that matched my own. The stone seemed to vibrate beneath my touch as I placed my hand on its surface. It was warm, not hot, but a strange warmth that seeped through my fingers, as though the structure was drawing energy from somewhere deep within the earth itself. I could feel my heart race, the sensation of energy flowing through me, connecting me to the mountain in a way I couldn't explain. Mark stepped forward cautiously, his hand hovering near the stone but not yet touching it. "Do you feel that?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "I do," I replied, my breath catching in my throat. "It's like it's waiting for us, like it wants us to make a choice." For the first time since our journey began, I felt like we were no longer the ones making the decisions. We had walked into the mountain's domain, and now it was directing us. But what was it asking of us? What would happen once we made our choice? And could we even turn back after this? The air thickened as I considered the magnitude of what we were about to do. If we touched the stone, if we stepped further into this strange, sacred space, we would be fully committing ourselves to the mountain's power. We would be crossing the threshold into a realm where human understanding held little sway. Whatever the mountain wanted, it would make clear in time. But the consequences, those were unknown, and I feared that once we took this step, there would be no going back. Mark, sensing my hesitation, turned to me. "What do you think is inside there? What are we really looking for?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm of thoughts in my mind. "I don't know, but I think it's something far beyond what we can see. Whatever it is, the mountain has kept it hidden for a reason. We're here because we're meant to find it. We just need to be ready for whatever comes next." I closed my eyes for a moment, centering myself. Whatever had drawn us here, whatever power the mountain held, it was now time to confront it. It was time to understand what lay at the heart of the Smoky Mountains, the very soul of the land we had unwittingly disturbed. With one last glance at Mark, I stepped forward and placed my hand firmly on the stone. A shock of energy shot through my body, and the air around us seemed to shift. This was it, the point of no return. We had made our choice. Now, there was no turning back. As soon as my hand made contact with the stone, The world around us seemed to collapse into itself. A deep rumble, almost like the earth groaning in pain, shook the ground beneath our feet. The mountain, which had felt still and patient until now, seemed to come alive, as if it had been waiting for us to take that final step. The hum grew louder, a resonant pulse that reverberated through my body, vibrating deep into my bones. It was as if the mountain was communicating with us on a frequency beyond our understanding, its ancient language echoing in the very air. The sky above us darkened, and a dense fog, unlike any we had seen before, rolled in quickly, swallowing the clearing around us. It wasn't the typical mist of the Smoky Mountains. This fog was thick and oppressive, swirling like a living thing. It clung to everything, obscuring our vision, and I could feel it creeping into my lungs, the air heavy with something metallic, almost electric. "Mark!" I called out, my voice swallowed by the fog. "Stay close." I reached out blindly, hoping to find him, but the mist was so thick that I couldn't even see my own hand in front of my face. Panic surged within me. Something was terribly wrong. The sense of unease I had felt throughout our journey intensified into something more primal. The fog was no longer just a visual obstruction. It was suffocating, oppressive, a living entity that seemed to demand our submission. Then, a sound cut through the fog, a low, guttural growl. It wasn't a natural sound, not like the creatures of the mountains we had learned to recognize over the years. No, this was something darker, something ancient and inhuman. It came from all directions at once, as though the very land was alive with its own feral energy. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. The fog parted briefly, revealing a figure, tall, shadowy, and impossibly twisted. It moved with a fluidity that was unnatural, its shape shifting like a mirage in the mist. For a moment, I thought I was seeing things, hallucinating, perhaps, from the strange energy that had filled the air. But then it moved again, and I knew without a doubt that this was no trick of the mind. The figure stepped closer, and as it did, the fog seemed to recede, pulling back to reveal more of its grotesque form. Its limbs were unnaturally long, bending at odd angles, and its face, if you could call it that, was a grotesque mask of contorted features. Eyes that glowed with an eerie, unnatural light fixed on me, unblinking, as though it could see into my very soul. "Mark!" I shouted, my voice desperate, but there was no response. The fog was still too thick, and I couldn't tell where he was. I had no idea if he was even still there. The creature's growl deepened, vibrating through the air like an unholy vibration. It moved closer, its limbs stretching impossibly far. I tried to move, to step back, but the ground beneath me felt unsteady, shifting as though the very earth had turned against us. The mountain had never felt like this before. It had always been a place of quiet danger, a land that demanded respect. But this was something else. This was an entity far beyond anything we could comprehend. That I took a step back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My hand was still pressed against the stone, and I could feel the energy coursing through it. It was as if the stone was alive now, too, pulling me deeper into its grip. I could sense it was feeding on my fear, growing stronger the more I resisted. The creature loomed closer, its glowing eyes never leaving mine. "Please," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "What do you want from us?" The creature tilted its head in a disturbing, unnatural motion, as though it understood my words. It didn't speak, but I could feel its presence pressing in on me, a weight so heavy that I thought I might collapse under it. Then, to my horror, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The creature wasn't just alive. It was part of the mountain, a manifestation of everything that had been buried beneath its surface for centuries. It was the guardian of this ancient place, the embodiment of the land's primal, untamable force. Suddenly, there was a blinding flash of light, and the ground beneath me trembled violently. The fog swirled into a vortex, and for a split second, I saw the truth. The mountain wasn't just an ancient place. It was a sentient being, its own consciousness tied to the earth itself. The creature I saw wasn't its only form. It was just a manifestation of the mountain's will. The mountain had been alive all along, and we had awakened something far greater than we ever intended. The light intensified, and I felt myself being pulled toward the stone, as though it had a mind of its own. The creature let out a terrifying roar, but its voice was drowned out by the growing roar of the mountain itself. The ground shook violently, and I struggled to stay on my feet, my body being drawn closer to the center of the storm. The stone beneath my hand cracked, and for the first time, I realized what I had to do. This wasn't just about facing the creature or escaping the mountain. It was about understanding the balance of the land. The mountain had allowed us to find it, but it hadn't been a gift. It had been a test. A test to see if we could recognize the power we were dealing with and acknowledge it for what it was. I slammed my hand down harder onto the stone, feeling the pulse beneath it grow even more intense. The creature snarled, but I knew now that its anger was not aimed at me. It was the mountain, angry at having been disturbed, angry at the intrusion of man. And then, in that moment of clarity, I understood. To survive, we had to give the mountain what it wanted: respect. We had to submit to its power, to surrender our sense of control over the land, and acknowledge its dominion. Only then would the mountain allow us to leave. I let go of my fear, allowed myself to trust in the natural force that had shaped everything around us. The mountain rumbled once more, but this time, it was different, deeper, almost satisfied. The creature slowly began to fade, its form dissipating into the mist, as if it had fulfilled its purpose. The fog cleared, and the mountain returned to its quiet, foreboding stillness. But we knew, Mark and I, things would never be the same again. We had not just encountered a force of nature. We had encountered a living, breathing entity, one that demanded reverence, and we had been chosen to witness its power. The mountain had shown us its truth, and we would never forget it. The silence that fell after the creature disappeared was almost deafening. The mountain, once an ominous and foreboding presence, now felt different. There was still the ever-present weight of ancient power in the air, but it was no longer a threat. It was as though the mountain had recognized us, acknowledged our presence, and allowed us to leave, on its terms. Mark and I stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to speak. The fog had dissipated, leaving the dark forest bathed in a dim, unsettling light. The world around us seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, yet nothing did. The creature was gone, the earth had settled, and all that remained was the uneasy knowledge that we had barely escaped something that we didn't fully understand. I glanced over at Mark, who was still breathing heavily, his face pale with shock. The events of the past few hours seemed unreal, a nightmare we had somehow survived. He looked at me, eyes wide, as though searching for some explanation that I couldn't provide. I didn't have the words to describe what had happened, nor did I think I ever would. How do you explain something like that? Something beyond human comprehension? We should go, Mark finally muttered, his voice thick with disbelief. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a plea. We had pushed our luck too far, and we had seen things that no one should ever see. It was time to leave the mountain, to return to the safety of civilization. But as I turned to leave, a lingering thought crossed my mind. The stone, still glowing faintly beneath my hand, pulsed once again, and I felt a shiver of realization deep within me. The mountain had allowed us to leave, but it hadn't forgotten. It had shown us its power, its ancient will, and that knowledge, that understanding would stay with us forever. The park would never be the same for us. Our perspective had shifted. What had seemed like a place of beauty and awe, a sanctuary of nature, had turned out to be something far more complex, something alive with its own ancient consciousness. In the past, I had simply viewed it as a place to protect, to observe, and to study. Now, I understood that it wasn't just a park. It was a living entity, one that didn't easily share its secrets. Its power, and the forces that lay hidden beneath its surface, were far older and more mysterious than anything I could have imagined. As we made our way down the trail, the weight of the experience began to settle in. The mountain had let us go, but it had marked us. Whether we wanted to admit it or not, we were now part of its story. And though we had narrowly escaped its wrath, there was no guarantee that it wouldn't call us back one day. That we never spoke about what happened, not in the years that followed. The events on Mount Washington remained a terrifying, surreal chapter in our lives, something too strange to share, too heavy to truly process. But I knew that I would never look at the mountains in the same way again. Nature had always seemed like a powerful force, but after that night, I knew it could be far more dangerous than we could ever anticipate. The mountain had shown us its power, and though we survived, we were left with the unsettling understanding that the world was far more mysterious and far more dangerous than we had ever realized. The creatures, the whispers, the warnings, it was all real, and it was only a matter of time before something or someone would come to challenge the mountain once again. But for now, it had chosen to spare us, and that in itself was a blessing, or perhaps a curse. Years have passed since that night on Mount Washington, but the memories still haunt me. Mark and I never spoke of it again, each of us carrying the burden of what we witnessed. The park is still there, standing in quiet grandeur, but I've never set foot in it again. Sometimes, I hear whispers in the wind, reminding me of the ancient power that sleeps beneath the earth, and I wonder if it's still watching. It's not just the mountain's beauty I fear anymore. It's the dark, secret force that lurks within, waiting for its next encounter. If you enjoyed this chilling tale from Mount Washington, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think lies hidden in the mountains? Have you experienced something unexplainable in the wild? Let us know your own stories, and perhaps they'll be featured in the next video. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss another terrifying journey into the unknown. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous places are the ones we least expect. Stay curious, but tread carefully. Nature has its own rules.